and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. Philosophers and theologians often talk about morality, sanctity, and prejudice. My guest today is also interested in these concepts and studies the way we make moral judgments. I'm happy to welcome social psychologist Dr. Andrew Monroe, who is here to share some of his research findings about how human beings make moral judgments that lead to prejudice and perhaps even discrimination. Welcome, Andrew, and thank you for joining us today. I know you're between classes and you practically ran over to the studio, so I appreciate you accommodating our schedule.
Well, thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure to get to do this again.
So you're a social psychologist. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about the research that a social psychologist does, and in particular, the focus that you have in your research.
Absolutely. So my research really focuses on how people make sense of behavior. So as a social psychologist, what you want to know, or one of the things you want to know, is how do we navigate our social world? How do we make judgments of other people? How do we decide who's trustworthy and not? And my particular vein of research really focuses on how we think about other people's minds and how we use that information to make moral judgments. So who deserves blame or praise or reward or punishment, those types of things. And in particular, what I've been interested in lately is how our moral values actually structure the way that we perceive other people's minds. So if you sort of endorse values that I disagree with, does that actually change the way that I think about what's going on inside your head?
So it seems to me that this is very interesting and has a lot of practical application. I mean, we live in a culture and society now that's quite divided, really, over politics and values and morals, and that sometimes leads to behavior that's not as nice as we might like it to be. So the implications for your research seems to me that we could actually examine how we might relate better.
Yes.
In society, right?
So that's actually been a big focus of my most recent work, where we want to take these sort of broad theoretical ideas about people's moral values, say, and we want to take them and actually apply them to trying to answer some real world questions. So one of the things that we really became interested in, so around the Supreme Court decision that allowed for gay marriage, around decisions about HB2 here in North Carolina, right, we got really interested in how disagreements over these decisions really seemed to be centered on the moral values that people held. Mm-hmm. Not so much factual disagreements about a merit of the case or whether or not bathrooms would or would not be safer or things like that. These disagreements were really about the core values and the core moral values that people found to be important. And so what my lab has been trying to do is study these moral values that people hold and look at how those moral values inform our beliefs about other people, but then also how do those moral values influence our decisions about, well, who are we willing to help, interact with? Right. What types of public policies are we going to be in favor of? So we're trying to take a sort of moral lens to answering public types of questions.
So anytime, and you started with the concept of prejudice, right? In particular, prejudice against groups like LGBTQ community.
Yes.
But I guess any out-group really this could apply to.
Yes.
So maybe we can come back to this later, but it strikes me that this might have implications when we think about things like immigration.
Absolutely.
Or any time that there's a group that might be considered other.
Mm-hmm.
But tell me about your particular application in this most recent paper you've written. How do you get to the measurement of one's moral values, and then to kind of trace how that feeds into attitudes toward other people? Yeah,
so I should say, this is some work that I've been doing with Ashby Plant at Florida State, and she's just been an absolutely wonderful collaborator, and especially on these issues of prejudice, where she is an eminent expert. And so what we tried to do is you can ask people about their moral values, and interestingly, people are really very willing to tell you what they believe to be right and what they believe to be wrong. In large part because we have just a human tendency to the things that we believe are the things that we also believe to be true about the world.
Self-validating.
Exactly. Okay. And so we used some other measures that were developed by people like Jesse Graham and John Haidt, that you ask people a series of questions, and you ask them sort of the degree to which they agree or disagree with these questions. And from these questions, you can sort of get a sense for the types of moral values that people endorse more, and the types of moral values that people endorse less. Interestingly, what you see is that it's usually not the case like people don't recognize like a particular moral value, but people vary to the degree. Like some people endorse moral values more strongly or less strongly. And in particular, what we were interested in are two moral values, specifically moral values associated with care, which really has to do with saying like things are right or wrong in virtue of, do they take care of other people? Do they prevent harm? Do they prevent suffering? So really wanting to make sure that people are psychologically, emotionally, and physically taken care of.
So is this a measure of empathy or empathy response in a sense?
Empathy does seem to be related to it. Okay. So the degree to which you value care more has been associated with having sort of a broader moral framework, that you empathize with more people. So that is one relationship that we do see with care and empathy. On the other hand, one other value that we were interested in was value associated with purity, or sometimes called sanctity as well. And this value has to do with sort of prohibitions about not doing things that would pollute your body, or for that matter, like pollute your soul. So not doing things that would sort of degrade your body, that might be disgusting, or things like that. And so we were interested in the trade-off between these two values, because one thing that we saw in decisions around, again, the Supreme Court, HB2, was that you'd see like some people who really seem to value this purity value a whole lot. Right. And they valued it maybe even more than they valued the care value. So it's sort of a trade-off between these types of values. And what we wanted to test was, does valuing this purity value more than valuing the care value, does that then motivate a particular sort of prejudicial way of perceiving LGBTQ individuals' minds, so seeing them as maybe a little bit less human. And by virtue of seeing them as a little less human, you're more willing to endorse prejudice towards them, you're less willing to want to help them, and maybe even more willing to endorse public policies that would be discriminatory towards them.
So you've got a link then between the moral value and then down the road in the real world, how does this come about? Prejudicial feelings and even public policy and discrimination.
Exactly.
So are those two values then oppositional in a sense, or are these just, care versus sanctity? And by the way, those values sound very religious, right? Because most religions are concerned with purity laws and sanctity laws, right. And we might talk about where that comes from. And most religions are concerned with relations with others and care of others. So it's interesting that the values you're measuring here are of particular interest to religious systems and traditions.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right that these values are not necessarily at odds with one another. One thing that we found in our work is that oftentimes you'd see people endorse both. People endorse and they really value care quite a bit, and they also endorse purity. But what you see on the margins is that some people's sort of values oscillate a little bit. Some people value purity a little bit more. And even though in general, these values are not oppositional values, there are some contexts where they do sort of directly get put into conflict with one another. And where we see that happening are usually issues, or in our particular studies, are issues surrounding things like gay rights or things like who is allowed to use a bathroom. And so in those particular contexts, what we see is that purity seems to really be associated with condemning people who might not have like the same sexuality as you, right. Or might not have the same gender definition or gender identity as you, whereas care has this sort of like broad, really expansive view of just everyone as part of the human family. And so in this case, we see that this particular context is one where care and purity are sort of at odds. But as a rule, they are not necessarily at odds with one another. There's plenty of cases where they point in the same direction.
Well, let's focus on purity for a minute. I think that's very interesting because you mentioned purity in the context of another word, disgust. And a lot of religious theorists talk about disgust, particularly disgust as a reaction to bodily functions, bodily decay. And many theories of religion suggest that human beings understand at an early stage that bodies die and bodies decay, and it's not nice. And one of the reactions to that kind of perception is then to develop purity rituals to cleanse one from contact with things that might elicit that response of disgust.
Yes.
So in a lot of religious traditions, then, one of the responses to this perception of the body really does come down to sexuality, not only orientation, but rather just sexuality in general, so that one of the ways to maintain ritual cleanliness is to abstain from sex altogether. Are we talking about a similar sort of reaction here?
Yeah, I mean, purity values do seem to really be bound up in, amongst other things, but one core concern is having to do with like norms about sex and sexuality and the sort of types of sex that we're allowed to have, with whom are we allowed to have sex. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right that purity has as a core concern sort of rules about, proper sexuality.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's nothing, I guess what I'm getting at here is there's nothing unique about same-sex orientation. It's just that that happens to be, if that happens to be sexual behavior that's outside the norm, then it's reacted to in the same way that any other sexual behavior that would be outside the norm. Is that like prostitution, for example?
Yes.
Or even any kind of sexual behavior that's outside the norm of whatever that group considers to be sanctity or purity.
Yeah, that's roughly correct. That purity sort of regulates, or one of the things that it regulates is sort of sexuality. And so to the extent that an individual would view something like being gay as sort of outside the sort of norms of purity, then that would sort of activate that particular value.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that could be balanced in by the more empathetic response of care.
Absolutely. And that's why this trade-off is so important for us, because individuals hold, like we know, like people hold lots of different moral values all at once. Sometimes these moral values conflict with one another. Like I really care about animal suffering and like I don't want animals to suffer. I also like my occasional bacon cheeseburger. and so like we know that like people can hold different and competing moral values. And in the same way, with this the sort of care and purity, people can endorse both, but the problem is like when you're asking, well, should it be the case that gay people are allowed to marry? Well, what you have is like your purity norm might say something like, well, that sort of violates a norm around like what we think like proper marriage looks like, where your care norm would say, no, love is love. And that we don't want to cause harm to people, we don't, psychological, emotional. And so there, like in that particular context, these things are sort of butting heads a bit.
Now, where I find your research really fascinating and important is that it's underlying all this is the notion that if you want to attack something like prejudice against LGBTQ communities and change behavior surrounding attitudes towards same-sex marriage, then you can actually do that by focusing on the moral values. And implicit in this is that moral values are subject to change and evolution.
Yeah, so the way we did our studies, the first studies we used some correlational designs where we sort of measured people's moral values and then we looked at how that predicted attitudes. But then later, we actually manipulated people's moral values. So we looked at, can we increase purity values? And we saw like when you do, you sort of increase prejudice. And then we saw, well, what happens when we increase care values? And then we see like you actually decrease prejudice. And this is, I think, to me at least, one of the most promising aspects of this research, that past research in prejudice has more or less focused on, can we change a particular prejudicial attitude? And if we can, then we can reduce expressions of prejudice. Our research suggests that underlying those prejudicial attitudes might actually be people's moral values. So if you change those moral values, if you can alter, if you can convince people like love is love, those types of messages I think can be really powerful, because if you change the moral values, then you change everything that's downstream from those. You can change the prejudicial attitudes and the expressions of discrimination. Yeah,
so you've been able to do this in the lab. You've been able to affect moral values. You've been able to measure a change in values. Now, I'm guessing that once you leave the lab and you get into society and culture, then that sort of manipulation or change in moral values becomes much more difficult. And how do you do that? How do you affect change in moral values in the real world?
This is the question that we, I think, as a field, are really wrestling with. That to what extent are the effects that we can demonstrate in the lab generalizable to real world context? And there's some really encouraging work on this particular score. So for example, we've seen over the last 2 decades, but really like last 15 years, that attitudes about gay marriage have seen a fundamental shift, that you go from a majority of Americans are opposed to a majority of Americans are in favor of gay marriage. And one thing that you sort of see as the causality of this is kind of difficult to pull out, but one thing that you see is that you see like more diverse types of TV. You see more gay characters on TV. You see examples of gay relationships. Like one example that I really like is Modern Family. You have a particular episode where, oh God, now I'm going to forget the 2 characters' names. Cam and I can't remember the other person's name.
I know the character.
Okay. But you see their wedding, and in that moment, and you see like 2 people who deeply love each other, who want to make a proclamation of their dedication to each other, and sort of recognizing that as care can be a really powerful way that we can shift people's perceptions and values, not just in the lab, but we can actually shift them in the real world by just exposure to more diverse characters, more diverse situations. I think that is one way. And there's some data to suggest like these really do change attitudes, and those attitudes change over the long haul. They don't just snap back immediately.
Right. Well, I know religion's outside of your research area, but if you will allow me to, let's just talk about religion a little bit in light of what you're doing here, because one of the things that it seems religion does quite well is protect sanctity laws. So if a religion tends to be legalistic, for example, oftentimes those legal prescriptions have to do with purity in some way. So there's that kind of conservative weight. And I guess that's based on some religious ideas that moral laws are eternal, right?
Absolutely.
Which is running counter to the kind of presuppositions that you're working with here, that moral laws can be shifted and that they're constantly evolving. So there's another tradition in religion that I would call prophetic, I guess, that seeks to change moral values and challenge moral values. So there is this kind of tension in religion between maintaining moral truths on the one hand and protecting them, and then seeing the necessity to challenge those truths and let them change and evolve and shift. Is that tension in the larger world as well, outside of religion? And do you see that kind of struggle, say, in the political realm?
Yeah, I mean, in the political realm, I'm not sure how much we update our judgments. That there it seems to be really very tribal, of sort of like my team versus your team. But within like the sort of broader world of values, we do see a sort of tension between to what extent do we want to maintain a particular status quo. And like just to be clear, like purity values, I think, do some really important work of sort of helping bind groups together for creating senses of community. So I don't want to paint the picture that I think like purity values are ubiquitously harmful. I think they do a lot of really good work for us. But there are cases where, like with any value can kind of go awry. And so I think one thing purity values do is they say, well, let's not change too quickly. They sort of maybe slow the rate of change, whereas other types of values might say, well, we need to change, like fairness values, for example. We need to change much more quickly than we are because of like imbalances that we see in the world. Right. So yeah, I think it's absolutely true that moral values not only compete and are sometimes in conflict with one another and for sort of like who wins out, but moral values, even within themselves, there is a tension between to what extent do we need to maintain, hold on, and sort of keep constant versus evolve, change, and move forward. Absolutely.
Do you think religion can be a positive force in this kind of cultural conversation?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, you look at, all of the monotheistic religions, many of the polytheistic religions, messages about care, messages about fairness and equality, like run through all of them. And so, in fact, I mean, one thing that we show is there's some really interesting work by Azim Sharif that if you sort of prime people with religious thought, so you get them to think about God, you get them to think about sort of religion writ broad, what you see is people become more generous, they become more cooperative. So there's some really excellent work that demonstrates that religion is a powerful force for good in the world. Now, of course, religion can also be like anything.
Sure.
It can cause problems, but religion seems to be something that does have a really powerful effect for binding us together, getting us to cooperate. But in that binding, one thing that happens is it becomes really clear like who is on my team and who is not on my team, and that's why you can get these sort of more negative effects of prejudice. But.
Yeah, so that's I think that's a very insightful point, and I think in general, oftentimes within religion, it's a little more difficult to think about competing moral values because the assumption is that morality is consistent and systematic throughout. So it seems to me it might be helpful to introduce this kind of research into theology and religious communities, just as a different way of looking at moral systems.
Yeah, I mean, and we see, absolutely, I mean, it's tough when you have, so if you have like a deity that is eternal and never changing, it's hard to say like, well, that deity like changed its mind about what it thought was valuable. But we see that, that you see like rules about what types of food are permissible to eat sort of change, like for example, in the Christian Old Testament versus the New Testament, that you have sort of prohibitions on eating certain things, and those are sort of removed later on in the New Testament.
Exactly. Yeah, so you're focusing on LGBTQ issues at the moment, but your research really has broad implications here. I mentioned earlier on that it would be easy to see how this discussion of moral values could easily be superimposed upon, for example, immigration debates today. And on, I think in your article you mentioned the NFL controversy
we've also done some work
with the national anthem protests and so forth. Where do you see this going? Are you going to broaden what you're doing? Do you see you tackling some of these other larger issues in the future?
Yeah, so the way that we're thinking about this is moral values provide like this really useful broad framework for thinking about disagreement, and in particular like, things that get moralized in the world. So within the context of the NFL, we're looking at values associated with fairness versus values associated with like respect for authority and hierarchy. And we see very similar findings that people who value fairness more are more supportive of the protests, and actually protests in general. Whereas you see that people who really value authority and hierarchy are much less supportive of the players, and also just less supportive of any type of social justice protest. Within the context of immigration, we haven't actually started that work, but I'm glad you bring that up. Like I think that's prescient, that is absolutely work that we should do, and thinking about maybe like issues of fairness and care on the one side, and maybe values of like in-group loyalty on the other. Like that is oftentimes how the debate sort of gets framed. But I mean, one thing that we see in our popular discourse, like all the way up to the president, is we see, dehumanizing language can have really terrible negative effects. And our research suggests like moral values can motivate those types of dehumanizing effects, and then those dehumanizing effects have negative downstream consequences. So our hope would be, by understanding moral values better, we can combat those types of dehumanizing tropes, the types of dehumanizing language, and therefore also sort of deal with the prejudice as well. So I think that is a domain where we would really like to broaden out in the future and sort of take this idea of moral values and use it as a lens through which we can explain issues of social conflict.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if people in authority in our society would have this sort of discussion about competing moral values and changing moral values and then applying it to the issues that are important to us today? This has been one of the things that I've really enjoyed as I've done this work, that it's helped me sort of broaden out and think more about, well, I have my particular moral view of the world, and I have particular moral values that I subscribe to, but realizing that other people might have different ones that they hold equally strongly, that I think really helps us understand like why disagreements happen, but also how like maybe we can bridge that sort of moral linguistic divide and at least have a conversation. We might not agree, but at least have a conversation. Well, I think this is really important work. Immensely timely and practical. I can't wait to see where you go next with it. And it has interdisciplinary importance as well. It affects the way I think about religious studies. I think it would be of interest to anthropologists and how they think about human communities. And so I thank you for bringing these perspectives to our university and to our program.
Yeah, thank you for having me on again.
Right. Well, I thank you and look forward to seeing what you do next. I'll be looking for that immigration debate.
That'll be the next one up.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank my guest today, Dr. Andrew Monroe, and thank you for joining us here on Religion and Life at AppTV. Join us next week when my guest will be Dr. Tom Ellis, who will talk about his research on belief and immunology. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.